us for our third bi-monthly Ask Me Anything live video series. If you missed the first two, the truth about asylum seekers and the so-called border crisis, and the family separation crisis 1 year later, you can still see them in the video section on HIAS Pennsylvania's Facebook page. I'm Cathryn Miller-Wilson, Executive Director of HIAS Pennsylvania, a nonprofit agency whose mission is to provide legal and social services to immigrants and refugees. And I'm pleased today to bring you a conversation in memory of the St. Louis. As it happens, exactly 80 years ago today, almost 900 Jews fled Germany on the MS St. Louis, which is ironic because on this same day, 5 years later, in other words, today is the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Many of you may have seen the stories that have been shown commemorating the events that happened on the Normandy beach 75 years ago today. The St. Louis is what happens when tyranny goes unchecked. D-Day commemorates the sacrifices made to finally check that tyranny. Denied asylum in both Cuba and the U.S., the ship, the St. Louis, was forced to go back to Europe, and hundreds of the passengers were sent to soon-to-be-occupied territory and died in the Holocaust. Today, we will ask what has changed 80 years later. Thanks to everybody who has submitted questions already. We're excited for our conversation today. If you haven't already done so, please submit any questions you have during the next half hour in the comments section. If we don't get them during this live conversation, we'll answer them in the comments after this ends. We would also love to hear your ideas on topics for future videos. We hope that through this video series, you can ask any questions you have and learn the truth about immigration and refugee resettlement in the U.S. We're excited today to be speaking with HIAS Pennsylvania Director of Refugee Resettlement, Rona Buchhalter. Rona's been leading HIAS Pennsylvania's resettlement program since 2016. Her team helps resettle refugees, but also provides case management and employment supports to those who have gained asylum and to other immigrants. So I'm going to start with a question from me. Can you tell us what the difference is between asylum seekers and refugees?
Why, sure. So this is a really common question or a common misunderstanding that comes up. And it matters a lot in some ways and not very much at all in others. So the main difference between refugees and asylees is where the person gets their status. Refugees are processed overseas by officers from the Department of Homeland Security. They go through very extensive background checks and vetting, and they get their legal status while they're overseas, and they come over through a very formal refugee admissions program, and that's the work that we do. Once they're here, we help them with a bunch of social services. It's live. On the other hand, asylees get to the U.S. however they get here, and once they're here, they petition the U.S. government to give them legal status, to give them a green card. An asylum seeker is somebody who is in that process somewhere along the way. So an asylum seeker in the U.S. is somebody who is asking the U.S. government to allow them to stay legally. What we see overseas is a lot of asylum seekers. So a lot of what we see in the news of the people crowding the boats and the trucks and walking across Africa and Europe, those are asylum seekers looking for somewhere to land, looking for a country that will allow them, much like the people on the St. Louis, that will allow them to stay in that country and, restart their life.
So just to clarify then, the people on our southern border, which are people that we heard about in the prior two Ask Me Anythings, those are asylum seekers, not refugees, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And they are not yet asylees either. So they are people who are here asking the U.S. government to allow them to stay here legally.
Okay. And refugees have asked the U.S. government that question overseas.
Exactly.
And were told yes.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So they have already gotten that answer. And sometimes it helps to think about little r and big R refugee. So globally, we talk about the refugee crisis. We talk about what are actually asylum seekers, right? People seeking refuge. little r refugee. In the United States, being a refugee is a legal category. So that is a big R refugee. It's actually a legal status in the US.
Got it. Thank you so much. So tell us a little bit more from your work with refugees, in other words, the group that obtains their legal status overseas. Why do those people become refugees? What are they escaping from?
Right. And this is where I think it matters a lot, and it doesn't really matter at all. Distinction comes into play because all of these folks are basically trying to flee the same kinds of situations, right? There are right now globally 68.5 million people on the planet who have been forced to flee. And that's because of, violence, persecution, death threats, torture, sexual violence, trafficking, all of those horrible things that humans do to one another, is really what people are fleeing. So overseas, the UNHCR estimates that right now there's about 20 of those 68.5 million. There's about 20 million right now who are in absolutely dire need of somewhere to go, of immediate urgent resettlement. And those are people who are victims of torture, who are medically needy, who really cannot stay where they are. And in fact, last year in 2018, out of that 68.5 million and then 20 million, 56,000 people globally got resettlement.
Wow. And so what happened to the remaining millions of people who did not get resettled?
Those are people who are living in cities undocumented around the globe, who are in refugee camps for 10, 15, 20 years, because literally there is nowhere that will take them. I mean, 56,000 people got resettlement. That is a minuscule percentage of the need.
That's amazing. So that's a good segue to a question from a listener. Bob Groves asked, do we have any ideas for good or better United States refugee policy? What would it look like if we changed the current policies?
Yeah. So, the U.S. we started a formal refugee admissions program in 1980, right? People are often surprised to hear that it was 1980. And it has, back in 1980, we admitted 200,000. We had a refugee ceiling of 200,000. This year, you may know the refugee ceiling is at 30,000. So far this fiscal year, we've only actually admitted 18,000 since October. So over the last 8 months, we've only admitted as a country 18,000 refugees. In terms of foreign policy, I think, I think that there are a couple of things we could do. One is, and I know that part of the question was, should we be investing money overseas? And I think absolutely we should be investing money overseas to try to stanch the flow of this refugee crisis. I mean, it is unparalleled. 68.5 million people is an unheard of number.
And by the way, I mean, just to respond to that overseas investment. So do you know what percentage of the current federal budget is given to aid overseas for these kinds of things?
Yeah. And it's funny because there are surveys that say when you ask people in America what percentage of our budget is spent on foreign aid, the answers are something like 25%, 26, 27%. The reality is 1%.
Wow.
Of our budget, of our federal budget, goes to foreign aid. And that is all foreign aid altogether is just 1%.
1% of our federal budget.
And the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is a subset of that foreign aid budget, is just 0.04% of the federal budget goes to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so what they do is all the stuff that happens with refugees and asylees and victims of trafficking once they're already in the U.S. It doesn't have anything to do with bringing people over But once they're here, it helps provide social services, legal services, English language education, all of that.
Now, we heard in today's paper that the director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement was concerned about there not being enough money because, again, of the asylum seekers at our border. And there has been discussion about reducing the amount of money that is going to provide the services that you just mentioned. So what kind of impact would that have on the ground? I mean, how would that affect some of the families that you see?
Yeah, I mean, it would, I mean, it's not going to surprise anyone to hear that I think it would be absolutely devastating and awful and fairly inhumane to bring people who have experienced intense trauma to a new place, say, okay, you can live here, but you're going to get zero help. I mean, as it is, the refugee resettlement program only lasts for 90 days. And as part of that, folks have to repay their flight ticket that brought them over here to begin with. And so our ability to help people is really very limited anyway, but we get them a place to live. We help with furniture from donations from community members. We get their kids enrolled in school. We get them medical care. We get them connected to some services. It's not a lot, but even that little bit of help, data shows that 10 years in, folks who have that little bit of help are doing much, much, much better off. They are starting businesses. They have bought homes. So they're really that little boost, which costs so little, really helps extraordinarily.
And if I can, ask you to share with us a recent story about how our specifically English services to refugee kids help, right? There was a graduation from 8 of our refugee kids, if I understand.
Right.
Just a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
And you want to tell us a little bit about, did they graduate? They graduated with distinction,
so,
right?
We run after school and summer and weekend programming in Northeast Philadelphia because that's a neighborhood with tons of immigrants, refugees, and asylees, and not a lot of programming to work with them. And the schools are really swamped up there. So Northeast High School, where we've been doing programming for a while, just had its graduation earlier this week. 8 of our students graduated. We were incredibly proud of them for graduating. And in fact, 3 of those kids graduated with honors. So to see, and in that case, it's mostly Syrians, Pakistanis, Sudanese that are in that program. And to see them not only graduate high school, but to graduate with honors, and their families were there with balloons, and everyone was so proud, and it was very exciting. Yeah.
And that's, I mean, I don't mean to take credit away from their own extraordinary efforts, but we also supported them for the last 3 years in their English language learning, right? Our programming and our volunteers.
Yeah.
And that's the programming that would be hurt.
Absolutely.
That's some of the programming that would be hurt.
And so, and that programming focuses on not just English language abilities, but also academic kind of catch up. Because what happens, again, whether folks are asylum seekers or refugees, they're in migration often for many, many, many years without access to steady education. And so there's huge academic gaps that those kids have. So in order to graduate and graduate with honors, and in fact, most of those kids are going to college now, and several of them have gotten scholarships, often very generous scholarships from colleges. So to get them to that place really does feel like a huge deal.
That's amazing. So circling back to the St. Louis and the lessons learned from there, I guess a parallel that it makes us think about is the Muslim ban, right? The St. Louis was essentially a ban on more Jews. And today we see a ban on Muslims. What is the effect, if any, that you see on the Muslim ban on families that we're resettling?
Yeah, I mean, it's horrible for those families, because people get here and they're really excited because they have a chance to restart their life, but they often are not here with their families. They're often here by themselves for various reasons. So people, I was just communicating with an Iraqi client right before I came down here whose mother is still overseas. And, there's no information available about her case. She was interviewed in 2016, and it's just been radio silence ever since then. So the lack of information is really hard. The unknownness of the situation is really hard. And we know the effects of people not having their loved ones with them. I mean, people live with such intense anxiety and worry and concern every single day for their children, their parents, their cousins, their loved ones. And so, it's devastating. On the Syrian front, in 2016, there were 184 Syrians who were resettled into Philadelphia proper. In 2018, there were none, right? I mean, literally zero.
Wow.
Syrians who came in. And yeah, I mean, we're down to about a third of what we were resettling a couple of years ago in terms of overall numbers. But
and so of the Syrians that we did resettle, did any of them have family members who were expecting to come over and then were stopped?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And especially for older clients whose children are over 21, often they cannot come as part of the family case because they're adults. And so often it's the children who are in their early 20s that are stuck somewhere overseas.
And still in danger, right?
And absolutely still in danger. I mean, there's nothing about the situation overseas that has gotten better. We have just reduced our doorway to, this incredibly narrow little trickle pathway.
So what do you think the St. Louis teaches us about our current experience? What can we learn from it?
Well, I mean, I would hope that people would see how completely obvious the parallels are. It sometimes surprises me that it's not as obvious to everybody else as it is to me. In my own family, I have relatives who fled pogroms in their, turn of the 20th century. And I think in the Jewish community, that is a narrative that we carry with us, right? People who have been repeatedly persecuted and had doors closed on us, often literally, as in the case of the St. Louis, and sometimes figuratively, and just barely survived. And those kinds of stories are the exact same stories of persecution, of torture, of death, that our clients are facing today. I mean, it's not just similar stories. Those are really
the same
kinds of stories. And, that scapegoating comes from the same place. It comes from fear. It comes from fear of the other. It comes from economic fear. It comes from instability about what's happening in your own country and culture that leads you to scapegoat, somebody who feels other in some way. So, as to your earlier question about policy, we should be investing money in ways to foster democracy in those countries, to foster stability, right? We know that climate change makes us all worse. We know that there are things that can be done to help governments be stable and help protect people and provide food and things like that. But I also think we have a huge obligation at two other parts in that process as well. One is in migration, when that crisis cannot be stopped and people do flee, those 68.5 million people, just from a humanitarian level, people don't have access to clean water. There is sexual violence. There is not education. The conditions of that migration period are really inhumane. And then there's once people get to a country, the refugee program is really it's humanitarian, but it's also a diplomatic tool. It gives us a way to communicate with other countries around the globe, to show some leadership, to help do some negotiations. And we have always had a legal process for people to come and seek asylum or refuge in the US. And it's vital that we continue to protect that legal access and that legal right to seek safety in the US. I mean, that is, so many of us here have that same kind of story about somebody seeking safety and opportunity in the US. And I think, we really have to do everything we can. And that means, concretely, that means like hiring more Homeland Security officers to interview potential refugees overseas in all the places that they're living around the planet that are in crisis. It means hiring more immigration judges and USCIS officers here to process these asylum cases. We wouldn't have to detain people if we could just have enough staff to hear those cases and then move on.
Right. Well, and that reminds me of another kind of concrete question I wanted to ask. You mentioned enough officers overseas to interview people and hear their stories. Can you give us a step-by-step breakdown if you are fleeing a country seeking refuge,
Right.
And you go to, say, a refugee camp?
Yeah.
How many interviews do you have to have? What happens?
Right.
Are you able
Right.
to share that?
I can tell you up to a point. So as you might imagine, this is, all controlled by the Department of Homeland Security. So they give us some information about what that looks like, but they also don't want to make it completely transparent, which I understand. So what typically happens is, somebody lives in the community where they live, where they've presumably always lived, and there is a crisis, right? Sometimes that's a long simmering crisis, and sometimes it's a crisis that happens in a flash, right? The militia comes into your town and they start massacring people. And so people flee, right? Like anybody would, you flee. I remember hearing from one gentleman, he went one way, his parents went one way, his siblings went the other way, and 8 years later, they've never seen each other again. And he had no idea what has happened to family members. So people flee in a crisis, and they try to seek safety. Usually they'll go to another town, another city, somewhere they can get to on foot, by bike, by horse, whatever. And sometimes that works for them, in which case we call them internally displaced persons, IDPs. Sometimes that doesn't work, and they have to actually cross a boundary of another country in order to seek safety, because something about what's happening in their own government is what's putting them at risk. So when people are in those second countries is typically where they're staying for long periods of time. They're in camps or they're in urban areas. And that's where the sort of refugee vetting process usually happens, is in those second countries. And the US basically follows the same procedures as the Geneva Convention. It's actually almost an identical overlay. So usually those camps are run by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. They bring people in, they interview them, they ask them lots of questions, they ask them about their story, what has happened to them. Somebody takes lots of notes. It's all very, very bureaucratic. But in the meantime, they get a safe place to sleep, they get access to clean water, they get access to a few basic things. Those camps are obviously not meant to be places for people to live for long periods of time. They're really just meant to be sort of safe stopover points. In reality, people are often there for years and years and years. But from there, UNHCR will try to identify the people who are kind of most needy in some way.
And they'll do that through interviewing.
Through those interviews, right? And this is at the UN global sort of level. And they will refer people to various countries that have formal resettlement programs, like the US, Canada, Australia, France, etc. There are 37 countries that have formal resettlement programs. Even so, altogether, we still could only resettle 56,000 people this
of the 20
year.
million that needed it.
Right. I mean, of all of those people. So anyway, so they will refer people to a specific country where they think that person might be a good fit. Sometimes good fit is because they have relatives that are already in that country. And we have always as a nation, sort of privileged family reunification, because we know people are going to have a better outcome if they're with the people that they love and who love them and who will help them reestablish. So if somebody is referred to the U.S., then that case gets transferred over from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to the Department of Homeland Security. And from that point, typically that is an 18 to 24 month process, almost 2 years of the U.S. putting people through a whole variety of background checks, interviews, clearances, waiting, medical exams, waiting. And what will happen is those medical exams, like certain of those clearances, will expire. So as people are waiting now for longer and longer periods of time, they have to kind of go back to the beginning and redo a lot of those security checks and clearances. And again, people are taking notes and making sure that their story doesn't change from one interview to the next, from one version of the story to the next. And if anybody knows anything about trauma and the brain, it's sort of hard to imagine that anybody gets through all that, because the nature of trauma is, you're pushing out certain experiences and certain memories and sort of creating a narrative that you can live with for yourself, and that changes over time. So sort of the farther away from the story you get, the more that narrative might evolve, not because you're trying to hide anything, but because trauma is something that people are actively trying to process while they're wondering what's going to happen in their daily existence.
Yeah. So that's very helpful. And I think just a kind of short summary of all that is that all those interviews and clearances require people on the ground to conduct them.
Absolutely.
And so when there aren't sufficient funds to staff the people, then all of that stuff gets slowed down.
Absolutely. And we have seen that absolutely, where sometimes it feels like there's 8 officers going around the globe interviewing people. Like it seems like a fairly small number.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we are running out of time. I did want to kind of give a shout out. There's a children's author named Rebecca Hoffman who actually wrote a book specifically about the SS St. Louis and dedicated the proceeds to HIAS PA, which was very generous of her. It's called A Light Extinguished. There are lesson plans that go with it. It's inspired by the history of the St. Louis and can be used by parents and teachers to talk about what happened, and of course to talk about what goes on today. So if you just Google A Light Extinguished, you can find out all the information you need to know.
Can I just make one more quick comment?
Of course.
Which is to say that this investment in refugees and asylees that I'm talking about, both overseas and here, it's not just a kind of high-mindedness, but it's actually very much in our self-interest as a country, because immigrants kind of are and always have been the backbone of this country. They are the engine of our own economic growth. So these are proceeds that, pay off many, 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 many times over for us as a country.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, because there are tons of economic studies, and we'd be happy to post some that prove that point. Yeah. Certainly here in Philadelphia, the revitalization that we've seen has been largely due to the influx of refugees and other immigrants. So thank you for your enlightening answers and information. If any of you sent questions that we didn't get to, they will be answered in the comments. Stay tuned for our next Ask Me Anything, which will be on Tuesday, August 13th. We'll be talking to Brian Bukenya, a refugee that we resettled who is from Uganda. He will share with us his experiences in a refugee camp. So we'll actually learn from person who experienced it, what's going on the ground, and the importance of raising the refugee ceiling. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Kathy.